Thanks to the organizers. This panel has three extremely complementary papers, which one, and I think we work really well together. So thanks at the micro level on our panel for this event. What I want to present is a paper a report that's going to be coming out in about 2 weeks from the Public Policy Forum that I wrote together with a couple colleagues, Heidi Horrock, who's also from UBC, and Emma McKelvey from Concordia. And what we wanted to do is to carve out a type of communication that is problematic to democratic processes and that we've seen being mobilized in different types of interference, including during electoral campaigns. We call it harmful speech. I'll say what that is and a little bit about our three recommendations for what to do about it. Right, so we define harmful speech as referring to communication that is abusive, threatening, denigrating, or that incites violence, and which may therefore undermine people's full, free, and fair participation in politics and political debates. It is, I'll say more specifically what we're thinking of when talking about it, but we don't intend to fix parameters on it. In fact, one of the points of our report is to say we need to have a broader public discussion about what kinds of speech need to be dealt with in what ways. But we want to be clear that at least some of these forms of harmful speech do interfere in democratic processes, particularly to the extent that they limit some people, some individuals, and some groups' ability to participate fairly. So particular kinds of harmful speech that we're thinking of are hate speech against groups. Often we're thinking about these from a human rights perspective in terms of groups identified on bases of age, sex, gender, ethnicity, and so forth. Targeted threats and intimidations of individuals. Coordinated harassment. And harassment can be a fairly broad category. We want to point out that there can be campaigns or coordinated actions of targeting of political parties, of individuals, including journalists, that can be coordinated by state-backed actors, by ideological groups, and so forth. And even if individual posts or messages might not count towards, say, being identified as criminal harassment, when coordinated, when mobilized, they can have a real impact on people's capacities for political participation. Oh, just the last thing I'd add, I'm not going to speak about disinformation, but there's a fair amount of overlap with that issue. A couple of quick examples to see what we're talking about here is the kind of thing you might the journalists in many countries, but here including in Mexico, have faced, which is different types of death threats. One of the ways in which, say, Facebook will identify threats of violence is whether there's including a weapon, how credible the threat of violence is, sort of a tiered analysis of that. You can see what that one is showing you. Here are some abusive messages sent to a Canadian activist this year, again illustrating the kinds of language that people can face in quite large volumes if they're public figures, and I'd add particularly if they're women who are public figures. We don't have a really good sense of the Canadian experience of different types of harmful speech, but we do have some indications, and one of them comes from this Angus Reid survey conducted a couple of years ago now that found that 27% of Canadians in that survey said that they had faced harassment on social media, and that included everything from insults and more just abusive messages all the way to cyber stalking and threats of violence. I could say more about this, but if you want, but I want to be clear that there's a, sometimes this is dismissed as an issue of, unless it's clear criminal violations, as an issue of just civility of political discourse. I think it's more serious than that, and we could talk about ways in which the attempt to harass and threaten groups and individuals could amount to things such as voter suppression, or at least difficulties in full engagement in political discussions on political issues, including during campaigns. How does harmful speech work? There's increasing bodies of evidence on who mounts, who distributes hate speech, who gets targeted in abusive or threatening language. I could say more about some of that, but I would just want to point out that particularly when it comes to this phenomenon in Canada, there's real gaps in what we know about what's going on, including what effects it might have on people's behavior and their participation in politics. There are a number of existing policy responses to different types of harmful speech. Here's a quick sketch of some of the legal frameworks in place. Certainly criminal law against hate propaganda, uttering threats, criminal harassment. There are others. There are possibilities for civil litigation on some matters, including non-consensual disclosure of intimate images, defamation. There's human rights law frameworks that can sometimes be employed to address this issue. I'd add that has become much more challenging in the last few years due to the removal of Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. And so at a federal level, that has become harder, but there are also opportunities within provincial human rights law to address some forms of harmful speech. And then it's possible that electoral law may be able to address some forms, and there is I think a proposed amendment referring to misinformation about people's criminal records or other sorts of things that could count as perhaps forms of harassment or defamation. But I don't think these legal frameworks, even if done better, can really handle the problem. Why? They are too slow to act, both, let's say, if we're trying to deal with issues in the course of a campaign, but also for people who face this kind of communication and messaging, often want things dealt with quickly, even if that means that there isn't going forward with a legal procedure against the content's creator. Dealing with it can be very costly and challenging, certainly if you're trying to pursue criminal prosecutions outside of the jurisdiction, outside the Canadian jurisdiction, very difficult. The provisions, rightly, are focused quite narrowly on certain types of infractions that, but for many of these things that we see as harmful speech, you might not want to be pursuing either civil litigation or criminal sanction for. And all of these issues are tremendously magnified by the scale of harmful speech. And just to give one little indicator of scale, Facebook in the first quarter of 2018 took down, I believe it was 2.5 million, or acted on 2.5 million incidents of hate speech on their platform. That's globally, over 3 months. So that gives you some, and that's just one of the types of infractions on that Facebook addresses. So, real problem of scale. So the biggest way in which our speech is regulated to deal with harmful speech is through the content moderation policies of the platforms themselves. And those have been developed over years as part of community guidelines or other aspects of terms of service for users using the platforms. And they are increasingly detailed, and more recently they're much better spelled out for the public about what they look like and how they're enforced. despite that improvement, here's where we think there are still serious problems with letting the platform companies address this issue through their content moderation policies. One, these policies are still too opaque about what the rules are and how they're enforced. Certainly, this is done better by some platforms compared to others. But for all of them, we have things that we just think the public deserves to know. Certainly, an additional set of information that researchers need to have access to in order to identify what's happening and what might be done about it. The enforcement of these community guidelines often can appear too arbitrary. We know this from smaller incidences or less publicized cases of people saying this got taken down, but this didn't, even though this seems to violate it, and that one, there's a lot of complaints about this. But there's also, even for the high-profile removals, like dealing with the InfoWars accounts a couple months ago, where the reasons why they were being acted on were not always clear. And I think the perception of arbitrariness creates a real legitimacy problem for the platforms themselves. And so that's why several people with the platform companies, but including Mark Zuckerberg, have said it would be desirable to have an independent appeals process to deal with some of these issues. From our perspective, we think that the policies and their enforcement are also too American in a few senses. One is that different countries ought to have some steering capacity over what kinds of speech, what kinds of regulation of speech exist. So we've certainly seen Germany pursue a different sort of policy around these issues than many other countries in order to achieve its approach to hate speech and defamation that has existed for a long time, that had tried to encourage the platforms to deal with on a more voluntary basis and then increase the fines if they don't, for instances, if they don't have processes to respond to them adequately. Another way in which it's too American, we think, is that in Canada, but also in a number of other countries, we know that civil society groups that believe that they are spotting real problems of harmful speech on the platform that are affecting communities that they're knowledgeable of, don't have good points of access to be able to get to the people who are making the decisions on these issues. So I could talk about what we've learned from some of the other state and international approaches to these issues. I wanted to just jump right into our 3 sets of recommendations. The first one is to say, I think we need to have something like a high-level working group or task force to fairly quickly identify how to better use the legal frameworks that exist. We've heard from a number of experts in this area, problems of resourcing, problems of coordination, other sorts of issues. Somewhat similar to this, the creation of transparency around ads, we think that there should be some legislated some legislation with respect to transparency reports regarding content moderation policies and enforcement. And then bigger picture, we think there should be a commission or some longer, bigger multi-stakeholder process to work through these questions around how to regulate harmful speech, how to protect against, to both regulate and address concerns about free expression, and how to divvy up the regulation or authority or capacities to deal with these problems. One of our proposals, the big proposals for going forward, and I can talk more about this because it's a significant one, is to create a Moderation Standards Council. This would be largely self-regulatory. It would provide the opportunity for the platforms and other stakeholders to get together, talk through what these issues are, come up with codes of conduct that they would pursue, on a range of issues around harmful speech and around the role of AI in content moderation, would include an independent appeals process and would generally help identify content moderation as a different form of mass media than broadcast and publishing, but also different from common carrier regulation, and help it mature as an industry able to better self-regulate, but we also think this should be backstopped with some government regulations. And then quickly, and I think in some ways most relevant for looking forward to 2019 elections, I think there's a lot of things that civil society and researchers can do to address this problem and better understand it, given support by foundations, granting agencies, and government. And that can include trying to at least even catch up to the quality of research in other countries on interference in elections, on coordinated campaigns of disinformation and harmful speech and those sorts of things. More attention to this issue of AI and content moderation. I think we need to better understand what works for people who are facing harmful speech and how to deliver resources to differently situated people to deal with different issues. And then the last one, set up an election contact group, which would be largely a civil society group that would allow quick and responsive communication between those who understand issues around harmful speech, disinformation within communities, to get those to the platforms and to get information back, and to have this responsive in that things happen quickly during campaigns. You need something set up to make that kind of exchange of information quick and effective. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.